This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Michael E. Sawyer, who teaches in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of a number of scholarly articles and books, including An Africana Philosophy of Temporality, Homo Liminalis, 2018, Black-Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X from 2020, and a pair of forthcoming works, The Door of No Return, Being as Black, due in spring 2025, and Sir Lewis, a critical book on Lewis Hamilton, also due spring 2025. In this conversation, we explore the place of speculative work in the Black studies tradition, the expansiveness of Black critical inquiry, and the meaning of multiple disciplinary interventions that comprise the field's past, present, and future. Michael Sawyer, hello. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Really excited you made the time. It's summertime, so I know everybody's busy and relaxing or vacationing or catching up on writing. So I really extra appreciate you making the time to talk today about Black studies as a field, your own place in it, the way you think about your thinking, the way you think about the past and future of the field. I really love your work. And I think in terms of your doctoral training in Africana studies, your work in the English department, and all these related things, I just think you're a really fantastic person to have on the podcast, and I appreciate you making the time.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity and want to first congratulate you on the platform. I think it's so important for us to archive. I've been listening to what you've been doing the last couple of weeks, so I'm up to date on how important this archive is. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what I'm up to and also, be part of the larger conversation. So you're doing serious work. And so I'm glad to be here. So thanks a lot.
I really appreciate that. This is going to be a year and a half long project. So, I think that's our goal, is build something like a talking archive around the field, with people at all levels. But before we get into thinking about Black studies as a field, your own work in relation to it, I wanted to start with a question that's really an invitation for you to narrate your own intellectual journey. I'm curious what drew you initially to the study of Black life, right? To do a doctorate, in this case, in Africana studies. What drew you to those kinds of questions, to that kind of interest and that kind of passion? And what sustains your interest in the field, not just the field of Africana studies, but in the study of Black life itself?
So I took a kind of circuitous path to academia. So I went to the Naval Academy. So I was a naval officer for a period of time. Then when I left the Navy, I worked in finance on Wall Street for almost 15 years and went back to school. And much of the academic side of that was because of my late little brother, Mark Sawyer, was a political scientist at UCLA, and he worked on Afro-Cuban thought. So I was always in kind of constant conversation with him, right? But that all stems from, I grew up on the south side of Chicago and on 112th Street. So we were surrounded by Black life constantly, to the point when I've said this, and I've said it and not meant to be funny. I didn't know white people lived in Chicago till I went to high school, frankly, when I went to school downtown to a Catholic school, because I lived so far inside of Black Chicago that when I encountered white people, it was in the different neighborhoods, which obviously had these different names, right? So I knew I lived in Chicago, but it was clear to me that their lives were so different than the life that I was leading. In the 70s, I was born in 67. So the 70s, everything that we needed was within, 5 blocks of my house. My grandmother lived 5 blocks away. We had stores, we had a bike shop, pet shop, toy store, clothes, everything you wanted was right there in the neighborhood, right? Which has changed dramatically after the collapse of the steel industry on the south side, with all the fathers going to Gary to work in the steel mills, basically. So I was always super curious about just what it meant to be Black in Chicago, right? And so when I went away to high school, I went to a Jesuit high school, and the theory was, theory and philosophy were like foundational to what we were doing there. And I had these monks and priests who were really adamant about us reading these kinds of what they consider to be the great books, right? And I was always trying to understand how I fit into these kinds of conversations, right? Not from a perspective of being erased for them, but from a perspective of how it seemed to me that what they were proposing, the way the world worked structurally, had something to do with the way blackness existed within that world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from a very early age, and even before that, right? Because in fifth grade, my parents sent me, and I think it's me and my cousin, maybe one or two other people, to pretty much all white except for us grammar school uh, in Morgan Park, right? And I remember when Roots came out, and I felt, looking back at it, I feel terrible for the teacher, right? This woman, Miss Essie, was like probably 24 years old, right? She got these two black kids in the class. And all of a sudden, the whole world has watched the first night of Roots, right? So we come back
Mm-hmm.
into school, then all these kinds of things start making sense all of a sudden, right? It's like the kind of differential between, what black people understand the world to be and what seemed to be the kind of dominant viewpoint of white Chicago at the time, right? Daily, uh, police violence, etc. And my mother's from Chicago. I grew up probably 3 or 4 blocks from where she grew up. My dad is from rural Alabama, Hale County. So I would spend summers in Hale County. So I understood rural black life in ways, and also could understand in kind of the constant back and forth of what it meant to be black in a place like Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
right? And black in a place, going back to where I was, black in a place that spatially seemed to me to be a type of Chicago that excluded white people in really important kinds of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as I kind of worked my way through uh, things that were interesting to me, the I was always a reader, right? And so I would read things like, Johnny Tremain, or these kinds of books that you read back then, right? And I would always try to figure out where black people would fit into them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would literally write these like stories that would like recast the whole thing with like some black character that was basically filling in some blank that I thought existed in that space, right? I never really understood that that was like a practice of anything besides, just kind of a, something to do and kind of spare time. And so when I decided I wanted to go back to grad school, it was literally an essay, or go to school, because I'd gone to Naval Academy. I was an awful student, right? I was an engineering student because I wanted to be in the space program. I was uniquely bad at it. But the thing about that was it gave me a type of intellectual freedom that I think dynamically bad at it. That like
These
I just don't
qualifiers
care,
on
didn't
bad are
care.
going to crack me up for days. But go sorry.
Right. Yeah. Bad. I mean, seriously. But no, but I was curious about it in ways. So, because we grew up in the 70s, right? So the space program was that thing that was like fascinating to me in lots of ways, right? So I wanted to do that, but at the same time, I was always this person reading. So I would cover these kinds of bad grades and all these engineering classes with really good grades in like literature and political science and history, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what kept me above 2.0 when I was in college. So I distinctly remember traveling. This is when I was working on Wall Street, and I bought an Esquire magazine and had an essay by John Edgar Whiteman, "The Silence of Monk," in it, right? And I read this essay, and it like changed everything for me. Like I literally went home and wrote it out in longhand just to feel what it felt like to write something like that,
Wow.
right? And so, and then I started reading more because you had these jobs, right? It's like, and so all I was really reading was like legal documents and stuff like that. So I kind of got back to reading the things that I really like to read,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Orson, Weidman, and so when I decided to go to school, I went to University of Chicago and did an MA in what I thought I would know something about, was like kind of international relations or whatever. And while I was there, my brother, I think, and Michael Dawson, who was my brother's dissertation chair, is kind of a joke, decided to put Bob Gooding Williams as my thesis advisor, right? It's like, and so I'm like writing this, and I know nothing, right? I'm like, coming from, know nothing
Mm-hmm.
about even what school means, frankly. But I've read all this. I've been reading this stuff for my entire life. So I'm writing this thesis on things that I think are interesting with Bob, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about, frankly, but we'll get you through this one way or the other. So that kind of get introduced me to what college and what higher ed was actually about, because as a practical matter, the Naval Academy is not really a college, right? And I was an athlete, so I really didn't care about school. I just wanted to keep myself eligible to be able to compete. And if I figured I had a 2.01, I was, good to go,
Mm-hmm.
right? So fortuitously coincident with that opportunity, Brown inaugurated this Africana Studies program, the PhD in Africana
Mhm.
Studies, right? And so I've been reading, and Weidman was a professor there. John Edgar
Oh
Weidman was a
yeah, yeah.
professor there at the time in that department. Achebe was there, Weidman was there, Patricia Rose, uh, Anthony Bogues, who was my dissertation chair, Anani Eugenio, Francois Hamlin, Keisha Khan Perry, and Paget Henry,
Mhm.
right? So this kind of, all-star kind of cast of people who were at the time really invested in trying to define what Africana studies was supposed to be. Corey Walker was the chair at the time, right? And so I applied, and like I I got in somehow. I got waitlisted. I got denied from every fallback school I thought I was going to get
Mhm.
into to get a PhD program. Literally the same afternoon, right? I'm sitting in like the Starbucks. These denials come flying. I'm like, okay, I guess this whole PhD thing's not going to work out. So somehow I was so that cohort, my cohort mate, Nicosia Shakes, and we ended up in that first cohort. And that was how I ended up in a Black Studies department. I applied to some other, like, because I was really trying to figure out how I couldn't, it took me until my PhD program to figure out how literature fit into what I was trying to do. Because really, I thought it was more kind of political science, political theory.
Mhm.
But really, at the end of it, if I have to define it, it's kind of uh, comparative literature slash continental philosophy slash political philosophy kind of,
Mhm. Mhm.
primarily, right? So it really wasn't until I was in at Brown, which was a really borderless kind of institution, right?
Mhm.
You can pretty much take anything you want, with a couple of exceptions. I'll mention that if we get around to them, where I had some difficulty with wanting to take the classes I wanted to take. But it was a rich environment. So that's how I ended up. It's kind of why going around this kind of long train to get to where I probably wanted to be in the first place is like spending time thinking about the way literature, to me, is a philosophical practice, is a political practice. It's a type of object lesson in what people are thinking about at the time, right? So all that kind of worked out, and Brown's Africana Studies program was kind of a rich environment for me to kind of pull that off without any kind of restrictions on what I was trying to do.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that was exciting. And I was older, so I was kind of upfront about what I wanted to study.
Mhm.
So I came there kind of knowing what I wanted to do. And it got tweaked out with some really good advice from people. And that's how I ended up, in the position I am now. So really, they gave me an opportunity I didn't think I was going to get, because I was a kind of non-traditional student with these kind of weird engineering grades that implied that I was like this imbecile, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
But somehow, yeah, so they looked past that and kind of gave me an opportunity. So I'm really appreciative for that. So,
Yeah, there's so many academics from the South Side of Chicago. This should be a separate club. You all should have your own
yeah, we should have
your
one.
own organization. And it's what's really interesting to me hearing you talk about is this combination, and this is a question that Ashley and I ask of everybody we talk to start with, and listening to them. To people respond, there's just so much ambiance that goes in to the kinds of interests that people have in the field of Black studies. And by that, I mean, like you said, it didn't occur to me that there were white people in Chicago and what that does to a philosophical imagination, a literary imagination, or just an imagination as such. But also these elements of complete chance, you're sitting in
Right.
that Starbucks. I mean, I didn't apply to graduate school during, with email. But I can remember waiting for the phone to ring. These are moments I would never want to revisit. But what a bit of luck to your the one program that reached out ended up being that. I mean, Africana Studies at Brown has got some fancy people. So
Yeah, yeah, it's one. I don't know what I'm doing there. This one, and like I said, like kind of not caring about grades is kind of an it's almost a methodological position for me, right?
mm,
Because it allows me to kind of take risks that if I cared about these kinds of things that I wouldn't take, right?
yeah,
So to the point, right, in disciplinary kind of conversation, I think is always implicated when we're talking about Black studies. I want to take my brother advised me, like, you should take the pro seminar at Brown's philosophy department, right?
mm,
So I sign up for it. I get his note back. You're not allowed to take, like, what do you mean I'm not allowed? We're supposed to be able to take anything you want, right?
hmm
So I let it go. I took some other stuff in my first semester. Second semester, I decided they have a Nietzsche seminar that I want to take. and I sign up for it again, get this rejection from them. And President Simmons, Ruth Simmons at the time, she was integral in kind of getting this program off the ground. So she wanted to meet with Nicosia and I. So we sat down with her. She's like, "Is there anything I can do for you?" I'm like, "Nah, I'm fine. I gotta, you know, one thing's a pain. I gotta drive up to Harvard to go to to take a Nietzsche seminar." She's like, "Why can't you take one here?" I'm like, "Oh, they don't allow that." She's like, "What are you talking about?" So she literally had to call over there
Wow.
and say to these people, right? Because it was this like hard boundary. And I don't know whether this stood for people in comp lit or other places, but me coming from Africana studies, there was no way. They're like, "What is this? You're just not taking this class," right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a uniquely bad experience. But the point I'm getting to is at the end of this road, I had to write this paper on Nietzsche, right? And I'm not getting a grade from this professor at all, right? So Tony's like, "Bro, it's like you got to get a grade so we can, put something in. They want to get some fellowship or something." I said, "No." He's like, "I hadn't finished grading it because he's basically accusing me of plagiarism because it was something I wrote that he hadn't heard before about the aristocratic value equation or something like
Mm.
that, right?" So he tells me to rewrite the essay. He's like, "Well, if you rewrite it and take that stuff out, you'll probably get an A in the class. If you just leave it like that, you'll get a B." I'm like, "I'll take the B, man." It's like, you can't, don't tip me with a B, right? It's like the
Wow.
notion that I'm like, for me, like being a person who was on academic probation most of my career, you can't threaten me with a B in graduate school, right? I'm like, I'll take that. And he literally couldn't understand like why I didn't care, right? And it wasn't that I didn't care. It's like I was free to like write what I wanted. He could give me the grade that he wanted, and I'm not gonna let myself be focused on your kind of bizarre misunderstanding that the fact that I said something that you hadn't heard before became problematic for you in
Mm-hmm.
a way that then shows up in a grade, right? So when I say it's freeing, it's I think it's a methodological point for me that I kind of encourage students to take those kinds of risks and not worry about what these kinds of structures of power are going to say about it, right? That
Mm-hmm.
manifests itself in the academy, mostly in grades for graduate students, right? So the worst thing I ever want to hear from a student is that, "I don't want to take that class because I may get a bad grade." And I'm like, so what? Right. It's like, and I get grades are important, right? And I've been lucky in a lot of different ways because of that. And I don't know why I don't recommend it to anybody, but I just think part of that is like being freed from these kinds of positions of evaluation that are designed to marginalize Black thought in important ways. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that shows
Mm-hmm.
up in grading a lot of times, right? And I think that it's important for our field to to basically uh, erect a boundary that allows us to understand that there may be some problems with grading and these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
external evaluations, but then learn to not care about it, right? To
Yeah.
be able to kind of skate past that and keep it moving. So that's how I feel about that kind of stuff.
Well, let me ask you about how you imagine the field. Especially in this way I want to put the question, especially in relation to the origins of the field. It has a mythic
Yeah.
origin, which is also its real origin of student activism. In the wake of the civil rights movement, in the midst of the Black Power movement in the Bay Area that spreads across the country. So there's that political agitation that also was an argument for a different kind of relation of politics in academic study on campuses and Black communities. Alongside that, of course, also what drives the founding of Black studies as a field is the fact that the Black intellectual tradition had virtually no representation in college curricula and higher ed generally and education generally. And so the development of the Black intellectual tradition is one of the imperatives that comes from that founding. But there's also this imperative of a certain kind of relationship, political relationship to community. And that, I think there's a tension there. I'd never want to call it a contradiction, but I also think we should honor that tension, the tension between study and the development of ideas and the political meaning of work done on campuses, done in classrooms. So when you imagine the field of Black studies, I'm curious how you think about that in relation to this sort of twin forces at its origin.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the term that anchors or the bridge between them is what you use as imperative, right? There are kind of two imperatives here, right? The first imperative was to use whatever means were available to force the type of recognition and opportunity that was lacking, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was imperative. Before you can get to the study parts, you got to open the door up for the study. So the notion of being able to actually study these things was predicated on the fact of having to push a political agenda in order to even get there, right? So that to me precedes the possibility of what it is we want to study, right? It's like, the people, and this is a Brown University story, right? Where they occupied the president's office for that period of time and then demanded, uh, you know, the building that they got, demanded the hiring of Professor Jorginho, who passed a couple years ago, those kinds of things, right? That was an imperative, right? And so that, and I think you're right to resist the notion that there's a tension between those two things because one kind of has to happen for the other to be possible, right? And I don't know if I think that, and I don't want to put them in some kind of sequential order, but necessarily when you have administrations that are resistant to, when you have a society that's resistant to the question of Black intellectuality, right? Period. Then you have to create an environment that allows that to grow on its own. And so the first thing that had to happen was this kind of activism and rendering it a necessity and imperative that those voices be heard, right? So I don't think that they're separable. I don't think it's productive. I think they can be studied separately in discreetly in ways that then take one as a particular type of opportunity, then notice the other thing is something that comes out of that. But I think the bridge between them is the term that you use, imperative, because you can't have one of them without the other. Because the point at the end of the day is that there was something worth studying, right? And so to this point, right? So as far as I know, and this is not even in the weeds of Brown Africana studies, the story there, right? So it had been denied the year before. The board, however this works, right, had denied the PhD program, and it pushed back basically to the people that I just named, saying, "Is there really a field of study?" Right? And Professor Henry had written this really interesting essay just on what it meant to be an interdiscipline and how Africana studies is an interdiscipline in the same way that something like political economy becomes an interdiscipline, right? It's kind of really complicated study, right? But what happened then, they were like, okay, we'll revisit this the next year, which would have been 2012, or the program would not have been able to start till 2012. Sometime in 2009 or 10, they get word back that they want to revisit it now. And the reason was because Achebe was coming to the university and said if there was no PhD program in Africana studies, he wasn't coming.
Wow.
So it literally took Chinua Achebe to arrive at the campus to force these people to understand that there was something worth doing, right? So you had to, in order for this deal to work out, right, to pull this person from Bard to Brown for whatever reasons the universities want these people around, right? So it was literally that's what it took, right? So you have at the same time you have a particular type of activist position that happened back in the 60s and early 70s, and then this kind of process that happens from a person who's literally his career is defined by the notion that the center can no longer hold, right? This kind of imperative that of what's going on, and that becomes a catalyst for the program that then has to happen in order for Achebe to arrive at this institution, right? Just it's incredible, right? To your point about these kind of synergies that happen in almost impossible circumstances. That's how the program came to life at that time, right? And so, that's an activist position, right? And it's also an intellectual position, right? Because that's not possible without the intellectual production that Achebe has produced, right? To give him that type of cachet where a board of trustees is going to say, in order to get this person whose canon of work is so significant, we're going to have to respond to the fact that he thinks there should be a PhD program in Black studies.
That is just a wild origin story. I mean,
yeah, crazy.
Boards of trustees have so much power that way, but they're also vulnerable to those moments of, one of the most important writers of the 20th century just saying, like, how about you do this instead of that?
Right.
I wish it didn't take that kind of pressure, but it does. And it is interesting to me to think about, the expansion or even just modification of Black studies. You talk about, the 2009, 2012, that period, that is at least a pressure of activism that is a push for representation. That's a push for expansion of the curriculum, because I think, unfortunately, what we've I mean, I've very limited experience, in my own world, but I think it's true on most campuses, is that what Black Lives Matter did was put a lot of pressure on universities to expand these programs. But that was really pressure that was drawing its energy from death, right? Rather than, we need representation, right? Political activism of the I don't know what to call it, of the non-death variety, right? And
Sure.
desire for this kind of representation and finding those pressure points that don't turn on death, I think is absolutely crucial. And it works, as you say, in this case with Brown. I mean, they went from Board of Trustees saying no to Board of Trustees saying yes to being arguably the most important Africana studies program in the country. So,
Yeah, it's small things like that, and I think your point is important, right? This is the death bound subject and all these kinds of studies of this,
mhm.
right? The way in which Black life, in some ways, inextricably related to this notion of Black death, and how that becomes uh, the point of inflection for a lot of things that have to happen. And there's a reason to want to resist that. There's a reason to want to get past that imperative and move on to another way of being. And that, there's probably nothing more important. Back to what you were saying about the future of Black studies, right? It has to be part of that speculative question of how do we exist in the world differently, and what do we have to do to force a restructuring of the terms and conditions of our existence,
Mhm.
the world's existence, in order to accommodate that,
Yeah.
right? Where the death bound subject is not, Black life is not defined by death, basically, to put it kind of succinct.
Yeah, that's a wild proposition to trot out in 2024, but it is it
Yeah.
is one to be. Let me ask about your own work. I mean, I like a lot of things about your work. I mean, we're both theorists, and I think you write with incredible like precision and insight at the theoretical level. Um, and so your engagement with both literature, expressive culture, speculative traditions. Um, I'm curious how you think about your work in that register and any other registers that you see it moving, how you see it relating to the past of Black studies. What is it? What is it? How does it sit in that relationship? But also, what boundaries do you see your work pushing in the field?
No, I appreciate framing of, and I really appreciate anybody who gets into what I'm trying to accomplish. The so my work is undisciplined in really, you know, important kinds of ways for me, right? And I mean that in the way that we mean with disciplinarity. And this is something that came out of my dissertation process. So I had a really large dissertation committee, but R.A. Judy was at where I'm, my colleague at Pitt now was on my committee, right? With
Hmm.
with Tony, right? And they allowed me. We had this like I had this dinner with R.A. He's like they allowed me to write what I wanted to write, right? And so it was a kind of non-traditional dissertation, which came with some, job market implications, et cetera, et cetera. But it was what I wanted to do. So for me, I try not to. I try to think of literature and as a philosophical proposition and a theoretical proposition, not and it's both uh it both is itself philosophical, literary, and theoretical.
Hmm.
And you can also apply the lenses of those disciplines to it at the same time, right? So one of the things that I think I'm doing, like I read Ralph Ellison as a philosopher, period. I read Toni Morrison as a philosopher, and I read them as literary as artists as well, right? And I don't think that there needs necessarily to be any separation between those things, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think some of that, back to your initial point about the kind of origin of the field and this lack of representation, there's no reason to believe that if the world had been different, that Toni Morrison would not have been a philosopher, right?
Hmm.
There's no reason to believe that, but there is reason empirically to know that Black women, were not welcome in the academy in that way, right?
Yeah.
I'm talking about, now, right? Like
Yeah.
you know as well as I do, right? Coming from University of Memphis, how the work that's been done to ameliorate that kind of
Hmm.
circumstance. So the same goes across the board. So part of that effort, what I think is an effort of excavation in some kinds of ways for me, is to go back to the work that's been done that I think is so groundbreaking and and reframe it in a particular way.
Hmm.
Not to save it from itself. There's nothing that needs to be saved from what Ellison is up to, right? Or what Morrison is up to, or Baldwin, or all these kinds of people whose names we kind of know as literary
Hmm.
artists, right?
Hmm.
I think they're working on profoundly important philosophical and theoretical projects that are imperative for us to kind of spend time focusing on with the different uh, tools that we have in our toolbox now, from the ways in which the academy has opened up in certain ways to allow
Hmm.
us to do something like take a Nietzsche course at Brown,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
then be able to use that opportunity to look back at what Ellison is up to and see where he's in conversation with someone like Nietzsche, right? Where he's pushing boundaries of a thinker like Nietzsche or Hegel or whomever these people happen to be, and have it have value qua itself as well,
Hmm.
right? Without
Hmm.
having to understand it's a dialectical proposition. So I think that to me is the kind of point of departure for me, and how literature is, for me, all roads lead back to Beloved in certain kinds of ways, right? Like I'm preoccupied with that text in multiple ways. And I think, the book that I just finished now, I had this long kind of chapter that basically puts Beloved in conversation with Invisible Man and Moby Dick at the same time, as if they're the same book talking back to each other in
Hmm.
in ways that I think work for me, right? They may not work for other people, but they work for me. But the point I'm making is that they're part of an intellectual genealogy that I want to be participant in ways that are analytic, and also in ways that are improvisational, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense. So I want to use what has been done as uh, melodic text, right?
Mm.
And then spend a lot of time as I can trying to innovate in and around these recognizable themes and tunes that we have, right? And see how that works, and try to push boundaries from that perspective. So for me, this is the second part of your question, right? Where I think what boundaries that I think that I kind of push, I think that where I get myself in trouble with, and I got tons of reviews from people who think, that there's no reason to ever publish anything I've ever written, period,
Hmm.
right? Like this book, that's the most recent text that I had, and again, this is the freeing part of not caring about grades, right? I also don't care about the dumb shit that people have to say about, you know, that I think is just, that I think is unethical in some ways, but that's beside the point in some ways, right? But what I'm saying is that where where I'm pushing a boundary is taking things that people think don't belong together, right?
Yeah.
Like I start this new project off with kind of Bob Marley, and I worked through Aretha Franklin's in the book, Train's in the book, Ellison's in the book, Hegel's in the book. All these kinds of things are in there, right? And this kind of uh, palimpsestic structure that makes sense to me.
Hmm.
So in many ways, it's structural, and this goes back to kind of my what I did learn from the engineering background. Is I think there's a lot of cause and effect relationships. So a lot of times I'm looking for what I think are intellectual choke points or intellectual points of inflection. And when I'm thinking about something like white supremacy or patriarchy or whatever ill that you want to think of, what I'm looking for is to probe it and try to find out where the weak points are and figure out how to attack those weak things,
Hmm.
right? And what I think is, I think a lot of that work has been done sonically with the Black musical tradition. I think obviously it's been done in our literary tradition. I think it's been done also in our philosophical tradition, right, and theoretical traditions. And so that's where I think I'm trying to be part of that conversation, both as I mentioned in an analytic and improvisation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you've responded to this and a lot to this next question I have, because I find this really interesting. Some of these words that sort of go together. You mentioned all of so much of this being embedded in musical traditions and strategies and concepts, melodic improvisation, innovation. I mean, I think that's something that Black Studies as a field absolutely embraces, right? Well, I mean, it's an
Hmm.
academic field, so you still have people with bitter reviews and, where to place books and
Sure.
so forth. But, and that's your PhD. And you're also in an English department. So I'm interested hearing both in terms of your scholarship, which I think you've talked about a good bit, but also about even in the classroom, how being in an English department with Africana studies, doctoral training, and more than doctoral training, sensibilities that have drew you
Hmm.
to it, but also that were developed there. How does that relationship between a discipline, English, which does have its own needs, its own expectations, and then Africana studies, which is undisciplined by nature, right? In between disciplines, mixtures, and sort of chaos of disciplines. So how is that split relationship, not split, but that joint relationship been for you both in the classroom, how you teach, how you present, somebody like Toni Morrison or Ralph Ellison, but also as a scholar?
Yeah, so I think so. Pitt's English department is huge. Number one, there are almost 200 professors in our English department, right? So we
Wild.
have under that umbrella things that you would understand as comp lit, film and media studies, children's literature, critical study, critical theory, all these kinds of things are inside of the the English department, right? It's kind of a catch-all, but not I don't think negatively at all. Uh, so I never really Pitt, to me, it was just I wanted to go work there because RA was there. And, I think his presence in Pitt for like the last, call it 20 plus years, man, has cut down a lot of tall weeds about between what goes on with the disciplines and what goes on with something like Black critical thought
Uh-huh.
or, the Black radical tradition, right? So for me, the bridge between the English department and Black studies or Africana studies is fairly short, right? It goes through just what we've been talking about, right? How the Black literary tradition has been preoccupied with these questions of freedom, questions of artistry, questions of beauty, questions of love, et
Hmm.
cetera, from the very beginning, right? So when I teach, I just taught a course in the honors college for uh, undergrads, right? And we read Invisible Man, we read Another Country, Baldwin's Another Country, and we read Beloved, right? And I had students from a bunch of different disciplines, a bunch of different, uh, walks of life, and people, tons of Black students, obviously, but tons of students who were not Black, who were there to kind of read these kinds of masters, right? So for me, the classroom is like a blank canvas, man. I'll play music in the class. We'll watch clips of videos. We'll talk about, anecdotally kind of what this means for the world as we see it
Hmm.
now.
Hmm.
So, you know, I think for me, the classroom space and the English department are, basically what Ellison would consider nodes, right? Just like places
Hmm.
of to me, of improvisational possibility, right? So I haven't gotten in trouble for it yet, but I just, we'll do what needs to be done to kind of get at the questions that we think are important. And, I start off to this point, right? I start them off when we read Invisible Man, we start off reading Melville's Benito Cereno because the final lines of Benito Cereno are the epigraph of Invisible Man. So you can't understand, to me, you can't understand Ellison's project unless you understand how he takes Benito Cereno as the point of departure for this thing that he wants to do.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
So even before you get to the I am Invisible Man thing, you got to deal with what he's doing with Benito Cereno, right?
Hmm.
And so I've had students before be like, what does that have to do? Because when this, right? When you're teaching Africana studies or Black literature, students will come to you because they don't want to be bothered with white authors anymore.
Hmm.
Period. And then you assign them Melville. They're like, what's going on, right? It's like, well, I think you expand the canon. You decolonize the canon by expansion, not subtraction,
Hmm.
right? Which, and I think to working my way around to I think what is the kind of methodological point that has to be made here is the English department and Africana studies to me are places where it's a binary conversation between the two, where both canons are busily expanding themselves in order to
Uh,
create intellectual opportunities that I think give a more robust understanding of what someone like Morrison is up to with her education as a classicist. Period.
hmm. Hmm.
She's working through these things kind of all the time, right? And so it enriches the understanding by being able to do that. And I think, and I'm not saying this is because, my first job was not the best place for this. I had all kinds of difficulties with figuring out how to navigate the, my positionality with respect to the disciplinary boundaries and departmental stuff. But Pitt's been a place where it's been wide open. And so I'm the director of graduate studies there. So which would seem impossible for somebody who has an Africana
Hmm.
studies PhD to be the director of graduate studies in the English department like Pitt. But I think it's because, and I have an MA in comp lit from Brown too. But I mean, that's what that means as far as being the DGS is probably little of anything. But I think part of that is because I'm like interested in people's projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in giving them the tools necessary. And if those tools are literary analysis tools, they're fine. If they're tools that I get from Africana studies, they're fine too. And I just try to give them, you know, them being students, the kind of latitude to take whatever intellectual opportunities they have in front of them.
In some ways, I share your joint appointment arrangement, or I'm less in English, than you, but also in a large English department graduate program. And I swear, and it's true of so many English departments, they almost are like area studies at a certain point. That level of
Sure.
of curiosity around literature, culture, history, theory, and so forth makes it for me kind of in some ways a less compelling question than say a philosophy department or a history department. And I mean that in a great way. I mean, the way you talked about your English department and the English classroom. And I have to say that I like that decolonization by expansion is a really significant idea. Especially when you're talking about people like Ellison and Morrison. I've had that with students where they not push back, but they push skeptical about, why would you talk about Melville or Faulkner in relation to Ellison and Morrison? And, thinking about, and I think this goes to the heart of some of these decolonization questions, like what do Melville and Faulkner have that's so threatening to the grandeur of an Ellison or Morrison imagination? And sort of that moment in an English classroom or in a Black Studies classroom, I think is so important, where, nobody runs second place to Ellison or Morrison. So you put them into conversation with the people they're in conversation with. We're not really talking about taking a huge chance. We're talking about expanding at the level of also appreciation. They had bookshelves too. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you about, this is a really speculative question, and has to do maybe with a little bit more of a critical approach to the history of the field. I'm curious what you think Black Studies has done really well, and what you think it hasn't done particularly well.
Yeah, I think what Black Studies has. I'll start with the second part, right, just to get that out of the way. I think Black Studies broadly defined, right? However, we decide to parse the terminology: Africana Studies, African American Studies, AAAS, whatever, have all these the melange of terms. So I'll just call it Black Studies as a shorthand, and it encompasses all these kinds of things. I think Black Studies needs to do a better job of resisting the worst forms of uh, disciplinary nonsense that attend like the kind of major disciplines, right? I'm talking about the kind of what I think are really petty arguments that happen amongst schools of thought. I think that needs to be eradicated. I think it's not useful. I think that um, I think I think we don't need, and there was a discussion a couple of years ago, right? And I was kind of part of it. It was somebody's going to write an essay. Is why is Black Studies so mean, basically, right? And the question was, why do we have situations where people feel like intellectual disagreement becomes a kind of personal disagreement, right? I think we can dispense with that, right? I think that that's not something that I participate in. I'm nothing but generous with people's work. I'm nothing but interested in understanding things that I don't understand, and also being the type of person who's open enough to understand that people may be thinking about things differently than me, and have value, right? I think that some of that comes from what happens in the worst type of disciplinary uh, strictures that come out of philosophy departments, that come out of English departments, that come out of these kinds of places that resist innovation. I think that we've seen, at least my kind of limited run around this field, right? I've seen kind of personally that kind of thing replicate itself, and I think that we don't need to be bothered with that, right? What we've done well is just the opposite of that. I think what Black Studies has been wide open to doing is listening to people's voices, right? And letting those voices evolve and flourish and, and come to points of collapse in some ways, right? There's a reason, like every argument should push itself to the point of its own collapse, I think, because that's where you can generate the next thing.
Mm-hmm,
I think if
mm-hmm,
we look at kind of the history of Black studies, right, it starts off with this need for a real historical project, right? Kind of reestablish the terms and conditions of the fact of what it means to kind of be Black on planet Earth from, the Mesozoic period kind of forward, right? To kind of get that out of the way, right? Then the next thing we have to do is then begin to examine the kind of artistic, what are the voices, the sounds, the kind of pictures, the whatever that come out of that whole experience, right? Then append those on top of that, right?
mm-hmm,
And what I'm saying is, back to the first thing I said, is that that effort doesn't need, to me, and I could be completely wrong about this and don't mind being told that, right? That kind of points of boundary crossing that feel like we go from like the historical Black studies to the literary Black studies to the aesthetic Black studies to back to the political Black studies to the I don't think that those need to be considered as points of boundary conditions, but as evolutionary conditions,
mm-hmm,
right? And conditions that require a particular type of examination, right?
mm-hmm,
The production of knowledge requires that we spend time on particular kinds of things. So I'm as interested in what historians are up to as I am with kind of, our favorite theorist of the day is happens to be up to. And I try not to let myself be lulled into a position of thinking that, I'm a theorist, therefore I don't want to read history, or therefore that person's an historian. I'm really not interested in taking a look at, things that happened over the past, right? I'm trying to think forward. So I think that part of what we do both, what we do well and what Black Studies does well is to position that, and what we could do better at is from a perspective of students and culture, and with faculty and senior all the way down to the most junior person. We need to spend a lot of time amplifying those voices that are doing things that we think are progressive or seem strident in some
mm-hmm.
level. That's what I think would be best.
Yeah, and I think that's where, what you said, and I know it's me picking these three words, but they really stuck out for me. This notion of the melodic, the improvisational, and innovation. I mean, what that does to intellectual relations, whether the relations to the objects of study we have or to the objects of study other people have and produce. It's led by curiosity. Like I said,
Yep.
I mean, every writer has their bookshelf. Every musician has listening habits that are all over the place. And,
Yep.
what does it mean to create an intellectual space in which that's not just our own individual practice, but our sort of ethics as an intellectual community? I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that your term ethics is exactly what I'm talking about, right? What is the ethic of not the methodological question? What is the ethic of Black studies, which then to me becomes a methodological imperative at that point, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you an even more speculative question, which is about the future of the field that will go beyond our lifetime, well beyond our lifetime. But it's really about the destiny of Black studies. Because the thing that strikes me is that, one of the imperatives of Black studies has been from the beginning to represent what has no representation or very little representation in art history
Yep.
departments and literature departments and history, philosophy, et cetera. And I think that's one area that Black studies has been enormously successful, right? That you find, in the 50 years of plus years of the existence of Black studies, I think it's no mistake that disciplines have become more diverse in their representations of history, of literature, and so forth, right? However fledgling, however partial, I think Black studies has really driven that. And so what then, in terms of the destiny of Black studies, and maybe a better way to put it, what would mark the success of Black studies? Is the destiny of a successful field of Black studies to eventually erase itself and no longer be needed because it's transformed these disciplines, that they take Black life seriously in a way that they hadn't, and now we really don't need Black studies? If it's successful, if it has that effect? Or is there something that's emerged for you as distinctive about Black studies that can't be absorbed back into disciplines or subdivided back into disciplines?
Yeah, I think for me, I think Black studies, and I'm talking about professional Black studies using that kind of term,
Yeah.
right, which is loaded in particular ways, but I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, right? I think that to to have scholars who are immersed and professionalized in what it means to use multi, inter, and transdisciplinary methods is not going to go away,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that becomes, in many ways, that becomes what the physics department is to the mechanical engineering department,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you can't, like mechanical engineers can't do anything without what the people over in the physics department have figured out, back to Newton, right? But they're not going to get rid of the physics department because, the people, you still need them doing that work, right? So in many ways, I think Black studies is we're defining it, and I'm using the term, and I would resist using this normally, but just for the sake of the argument, professional Black studies becomes to me what the physics department is to applied science, right? Or the chemistry department or biology department.
Mm.
You can have all kinds of innovation, and people will end up over, like I could end up like I'm in the English department, right? But I'm coming from a Black studies background, which means that I did a ton of stuff with literature, which means I did a ton of stuff with history. I did a ton of stuff with political science. I did a ton of stuff with theory, did a ton of stuff with philosophy. But I'm in a department that's designed to the critical examination of literature. So I'm bringing all that stuff with me over there to do that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that means to me is that the future of Black studies is just that, right? There needs to be the professionalization in the way that we're accomplishing that of the field of the non-discipline discipline,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in kind of um, like a way to kind of degrade it based upon other disciplines. When I say undisciplined, I mean positively so, positively undisciplined in ways that,
Mm-hmm.
right, that are meant to answer kinds of questions instead of answer questions in a particular way. But at the same time, it then provides the possibility of someone being in the geography department who's comes from Black studies, who's understanding, demographic data and geographic examination in ways that are inextricable from what you understand as being kind of important questions that are Black studies questions. In the
Mm-hmm.
same way that how you resolve the gravity when building a building is a foundational question in physics. It then shows up with the civil engineers, right? They got to figure that out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Black studies goes anywhere. I think there will always be, to me, there always should be a department of Black studies, and there should always be these kinds of really close relationships with colleagues and scholars and students and whomever else, activists, everybody else outside of that, that circle,
Mm-hmm.
that are also had these kinds of um, points of close relationship between them that I think enrich everybody's engagement, right? Because, just a short kind of analogy, right? It's like, when I'm in Colorado, I'll go fly fishing. I've never caught anything fly fishing, never, right? It's a process, right? And so when I go fly fishing, I'm defining what I'm doing. So what I can say is I'm examining this from a perspective of critical theory, or I'm using uh, epistemology to examine a particular thing, right? I'm fly fishing at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I gotta eat, I'll like throw a net in there. I'll hit the fish over the head with a stick, whatever. So you got to have the tools in your tool belt to do that, right? So if I'm doing, I think, and this gets back to my point about, I think that sometimes it would be useful if scholars would say, I'm fly fishing right now. So don't ask me why I didn't do this, because I'm doing this,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's value to doing that, right? That's an exercise in a particular way. It's a fugue, right? I'm working through Chopin. I'm doing this, right? It's an exercise, right? That's cool, right? Great. But if a person's just trying to eat, then we're going to grab everything that we can and enter multi and transdisciplinary fashion to answer a critical question like, how do we take care of infant mortality in Washington, D.C.? We need theorists, we need poets, we need everybody we can get to be focused on that question, right? And that to me is what Black studies allows, is that type of gathering. Just call it intellectual gathering,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's something that we should continue to push, and I think that students in other disciplines should find the opportunity to take, you know, the Africana Studies, the Black Studies Pro seminar, in ways that they wouldn't let me take the philosophy pro seminar at Brown,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you go to the pro seminar and you pick up the kind of
Yeah.
basics of what happens. So then when you need to interact with someone, you have a common language, right,
Yeah.
between you that helps you kind of create these kinds of opportunity, intellectual opportunities. So that's what I think the positive future of Black studies would look like.
Yeah, and it's really interesting hearing you talk about it, and it makes me wonder. This is sort of follow up. I'm curious if you have thoughts on this, but I do wonder. It's a particularly sharp way of putting a question I've had for a while. How much the future of the field of Black studies as Black studies, and not just a collection of disciplinary approaches to Black life, right? So Black studies as
Hmm.
Black studies, how much its future depends on Black studies departments having a significant number of people whose PhDs are in the field. That's not me, that's you, which means I had to come
Yeah.
to this like later in the midst of a regular career, whereas for you, this is where you begin as a grad student, right? But that's where you begin. And I wonder about the future of the field if it doesn't have a significant population of people whose own intellectual sort of, I keep saying training, but it's really like it's a long journey that changes your entire sensibilities. If it's not coming from those doctoral programs, how is the future of the field less clear in those terms you just put?
Yeah, I think that, this is one of those really difficult questions. And I think, English went through this with comparative literature,
Yeah.
on and on and on, right? There's always this question of whether. So I think for me, let's just put it simply, right? If we're hiring a person in Africana studies, am I going to privilege a person who has a PhD in Black studies? Maybe. Depends on what the person's working on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that this is part of what I was saying about not replicating these kinds of nonsensical disciplinary boundaries that happen in other
Mm-hmm.
disciplinary
Mm-hmm.
professions, right? So I think we should be as open to a person who has a PhD in, you know, history as we are to a person who's coming from Yale's, PhD program or Northwest or wherever, whatever
Uh-huh.
place you in Temple, wherever you want to talk about, right? I think that to me needs to be the ethic of how Black studies functions in the hiring environment, in the hiring world,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need to be able to place Africana Studies PhD graduates. And I think that that ethic needs to be able to place them in places as obvious as Black Studies department, but as inobvious as the English department in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that to me is a binary proposition. I think then it becomes, it's a seed that gets planted in places, right? And I
Yeah.
think it's productive, and I think it enriches. I think it does nothing but enrich the intellectual environment in colleges and universities.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. So, one last question then. You, I think you've traced out a lot of response to this, but just to put it directly, like thinking about just the future of the field, what for you do you think are the most important questions or question we should be asking?
So I think the question that preoccupies me, and that doesn't mean it's the most important. It means it's the most important for me, right? It may be not important to other people. Is what does the world? And this is a Toni Morrison question, right? From the from her set of essays, right, where she asks the question about, where she poses the question of how do we construct a world that's where blackness is not uh, dialectically opposed to whiteness, right?
Mm.
I'm curious to know. I'm curious to spend my time thinking about what blackness is qua itself.
Hmm.
Period. Right? Is and what is black being? How does black subjectivity and black being define itself? And I want to be able to understand that in ways that are uh, politically actionable, right? Because it's a profoundly abstract question, and I kind of start from the abstract and work to the concrete as opposed to the opposite of that.
Hmm.
And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think both ways kind of work in important ways. But for me, I start from the question of these kinds of abstractions. Then I want to think about how is that a practical political project,
Hmm.
right? How do we drag the world kind of kicking and screaming to a point where something like thinking that black people should be safe is not a utopian idea,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's nothing more profoundly absurd to me, and this is not to to be to be pedantic about it, but you think about something like black life or black life as successful being framed as utopianism. To me, is like a profoundly reductive kind of way of understanding possibility,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I want to be thinking about how do we create a world that is open and engaging and not predicated on horror constantly, or, to your point, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the fact that we get to these places, we get to the university funding things because George Floyd gets strangled to death in the street in front of everybody watching it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wish I'd never heard of Breonna Taylor. Period. I wish Breonna Taylor were doing about Breonna Taylor's business right now, and me and you were talking about something completely different.
Yeah.
And Breonna Taylor is not a name that would ever have occurred to us, right? That's the world that I want to be able to live in,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm thinking, and that to me is an aesthetic question, right? I think Black aesthetic has been on this question for the longest time.
Mm-hmm.
I think these are philosophical questions. Obviously, they're political questions, they're theoretical questions, and they're also activist questions, right? So I think figuring out how to have a common language between those ways of approaching that problem, to me, is imperative. And I think that picks up environmental concerns, that picks up, practical concerns about economics, practical concerns about, you know, gender equality, all these kinds of things are embedded in that same question.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would think the kind of most important way forward would probably be.
I love that. It's a really fantastic place to conclude. And I don't know what to say except that I found that response really moving and a really important way of wrapping together, as you yourself put it, theoretical questions and some basic questions about the future of humanity, specifically the idea of Black humanity having a future, as referring to itself. So I really thank you for your time. This was fantastic. I love your work. And it's been great to hear you talk about what I know is both the past of your work and the future of your work in this conversation. Really insightful and important, and I'm glad to have a chance to get some ears on it. So thanks for making the time and offering all these thoughts.
No, and really, again, congratulations on the platform. This is something that we really needed. So, and you're the best person to be doing this. So I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Take care.